On a clear morning over Lebanon, an Israeli radar operator watched a single contact cross his screen. The target was above 65,000 feet, moving faster than twice the speed of sound, and it was not turning. He knew what it was. He also knew that nothing his Air Force owned could reach it. The MiG-25 Foxbat had been doing this for a decade, over the Sinai, over the Nile Delta, over Israeli airfields, photographing whatever it wanted and going home. On paper, the interception being attempted below him was arithmetic that did not close. On the 13th of February 1981, the arithmetic changed. The Foxbat was the fastest combat aircraft ever to enter frontline service. Two enormous Tumansky turbojets, a fuselage built largely from nickel steel rather than titanium, a radar so powerful that Western engineers assumed it could burn through any jamming the West possessed. In level flight, it could hold Mach 2.8, and in extremis, it had been recorded above Mach 3.2. It carried 4 large air-to-air missiles under a wing thick enough to survive the heat of that speed. Every published figure about the aircraft was a record, and every record pointed in the same direction. Nothing in the Western inventory could catch it. Israel had learned this the hard way. In 1971, Soviet-piloted MiG-25 reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Sinai Peninsula in broad daylight at altitudes and speeds the Israeli Air Force could only watch. F-4 Phantoms scrambled and climbed until their engines starved. Missiles were fired, and they fell away, bleeding energy long before they reached the target. Israeli commanders sat through post-flight briefings that all ended the same way, with a map, a track line drawn straight across their own territory, and no answer. The photographs those flights brought back went to Moscow, and from Moscow to Cairo and Damascus, and there was nothing anyone at Tel Nof or Hatzor could do about it. For a country whose entire security doctrine assumed control of its own sky, the Foxbat was not a nuisance. It was a hole in the roof. The aircraft Israel eventually pointed at that hole was the F-15 Eagle, and by the numbers that mattered to a Soviet designer, the Eagle lost. It was slower. Its service ceiling was lower. In a straight line race across the sky, no F-15 pilot would ever see the back of a Foxbat again. There was no faster fighter to buy, because the West had never built one, and the West had never built one because it had asked a different question. The Israeli problem was therefore not procurement. It was arithmetic of a different kind, and it would take 2 years to solve. Speed, it turned out, had been paid for. The Foxbat's steel airframe was enormously heavy, and with a full missile load, the aircraft was restricted to roughly 4.5 G, less than a nimble airliner in an emergency turn. It could not maneuver in any meaningful sense. Its engines, pushed to their maximum, could destroy themselves in minutes. Its combat radius, once it lit the afterburners, collapsed to a few hundred kilometers. The Foxbat was not a fighter. It was a missile with a cockpit, designed to fly in a straight line at a bomber that was already in front of it. And then there was the radar. The smirch set in the nose was among the most powerful ever fitted to a fighter, and it was almost blind in the one geometry that mattered. Looking down at a target below its own altitude, the beam struck the ground and returned an avalanche of clutter, a wall of false echoes from rocks, buildings, water, and hills. The Soviet answer was to fly above the problem. The Foxbat lived high because low was where its own radar failed it, and every Soviet interceptor doctrine of the era was built on the assumption that ground control would tell the pilot where to look. The Eagle carried the opposite answer. Its APG-63 was a pulse Doppler radar, built to strip ground clutter out of the return by measuring the motion of the target rather than its position, and it was designed from the first sketch to look down and shoot down. Slung beneath the fuselage were AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, semi-active, guided by radar energy. The fighter kept pointed at the target until impact. None of this made the F-15 faster. What it made the F-15 was capable of killing something that was faster, provided the killing happened in the right place, at the right moment, from the right angle. That was the doctrine, and the doctrine was the weapon. Israeli planners spent 2 years studying the Syrian reconnaissance flights, the way an entomologist studies a species. They logged the routes, the altitudes, the times of day, the point on the coastline where the Foxbats crossed. They noticed that the flights were routine, and that routine is a form of surrender. Then they built the intercept backwards, starting not from the fighter, but from the missile, and asking where an AEM-7 Sparrow would still have energy left when it arrived. The answer was head-on, from above, against a target closing at Mach 2.5. On the 13th of February 1981, a Syrian MiG-25 crossed the Lebanese coast on a familiar heading. The pilot had flown this line before, in this aircraft, under this sky, and had returned every time. His ground controllers reported nothing unusual, because there was nothing unusual to report. The Israeli F-15s had launched long before he did. They were already high, already positioned along the line his aircraft was about to fly, and their radars stayed cold while a controller on the ground fed them his track in silence. The Eagle did not chase him. It waited for him. The Sparrow left the rail head-on. Against a fleeing target, a semi-active missile spends its energy running the target down and often arrives exhausted. Against a target coming at it, the closing speed of the Foxbat is added to the closing speed of the missile, and the geometry that made the MiG-25 untouchable in a tail chase became the thing that killed it. There was almost nothing the Syrian pilot could do. He could not turn, not at that speed, not in that airframe. Everything that had protected him for a decade was now working against him. The fastest fighter in the world fell into Lebanon. 5 months later, the pattern repeated. A second Syrian Foxbat crossed the same kind of line and did not come home. The reconnaissance flights over Israeli territory stopped, and with them stopped the assumption that had made them possible, which was that altitude and speed were a form of armor. The Bekaa Valley, a year later, would be flown under a very different set of rules by both sides. In Damascus and in Moscow, the conclusion was hard to escape, and harder to admit, because the Israeli Air Force had not bought a faster aircraft, had not fielded a new missile, and had not outflown anyone. It had simply decided where the fight would happen before the Syrian pilot took off. None of this means the Foxbat was a bad aircraft, and the honest version of the story has to include the day it proved that. On the 17th of January 1991, in the opening hours of Desert Storm, an Iraqi MiG-25 fired on a U.S. Navy FA-18 Hornet, flown by Lieutenant Commander Michael Scott Spiker, and brought it down over western Iraq, the first American aircraft lost to enemy fire in the war. 2 nights later, a flight of Foxbats fought American F-15s over central Iraq, evaded a string of AIM-7 Sparrows fired at them, and left the engagement intact. Same airframe, same limitations. A completely different result, because the Iraqis had used the Foxbat the way it was designed to be used, as a fast, straight, single-pass weapon under close ground control, and their opponents had, for a moment, forgotten what they were shooting at. The aircraft had not improved since 1981. The thinking around it had. That is the shape of the whole story. The MiG-25 was never beaten by a better airplane. It was beaten by a better question. The Soviets asked how fast a fighter could go, and they answered brilliantly, producing an aircraft that still holds records 4 decades after the last one was built. The Israelis asked where a missile could still kill, and they answered that too. Only one of those questions decides an air battle. Speed is measurable, publishable, printable in a brochure, and easy to be proud of. Position, timing, and the willingness to study an enemy's habits for 2 years before firing a shot are none of those things, and they are what actually killed the Foxbat over Lebanon. The pilots who flew the F-15 that day did not win because they had the superior machine. They won because someone on the ground had already fought the battle, on paper, with maps and clocks and flight logs, months before anyone left the runway. Hardware brings the aircraft to the fight. Doctrine decides which fight it is. This is WarShadow, where we study the moments when doctrine quietly beats hardware. Subscribe and stay with us. The metric that mattered was never the one printed on the brochure.